My name is Freya. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been known as the steady one. The woman who remembers birthdays without reminders. The one who keeps receipts, schedules dentist appointments, and smooths over awkward silences at dinner parties. I've been a wife, a professional, and a quiet contributor to other people's comfort. If you met me in passing, you might describe me as calm, practical, maybe even a little predictable. People often assume that women like me don't have edges, that we're built to absorb, to adapt, to endure, that if something hurts us, we'll explain it away with fatigue, stress, or timing. I used to believe that about myself, too. The story isn't about rage or revenge. It's not about exposing anyone for entertainment or turning pain into spectacle. It's about clarity, how it arrives slowly, almost politely, and how once it's there, it can't be unlearned. It's about what happens when you stop accepting the explanation that's easiest for everyone else. When my husband said we were just tired, I nodded. When distance crept in, I told myself it was a season, not a signal. We had built a life that looked stable from the outside, and I was invested in protecting that image, not because I was afraid to lose him, but because I didn't yet know what I was losing myself. The truth didn't come with drama, no shouting, no slammed doors. It arrived quietly, on an ordinary afternoon, through messages I found on a shared tablet we'd both used for years. There was no shock in the cinematic sense, just a deep, steady recognition, the kind that settles in your body before your mind catches up. Over the course of this story, I'll walk you through what it's like to be slowly repositioned in your own life, how disrespect can be subtle enough to feel deniable, how silence can look like weakness until it becomes a choice, and how power doesn't always announce itself when it arrives. I won't exaggerate and I won't vilify. Everyone in this story is human, including me. What I can promise is honesty about the small moments we ignore, the rationalizations we make, and the calm decisions that change everything without anyone noticing at first. This isn't a story about winning. It's about seeing clearly and acting in alignment with that clarity. So before we begin, I want to ask you something gently. Have you ever sensed that something in your life was off, long before you had proof, and wondered whether trusting yourself would cost you more or save you? To most people in our lives, I was the stable center, the one you didn't worry about. If something needed organizing, remembering, or fixing quietly before it became a problem, it usually landed with me, and I rarely complained. Not because I enjoyed it, but because competence has a way of becoming invisible once people grow used to it. In our marriage, I was described as low maintenance. Friends said it like it was a compliment. My husband said it with relief. I didn't argue because at the time, I thought it meant I was secure, self-sufficient, mature enough not to need constant reassurance. What it really meant was that my needs didn't interrupt anyone else's rhythm. I handled logistics without ceremony. Travel plans, shared finances, family obligations. Those things lived comfortably in my head. If something went wrong, I absorbed the friction. If something went right, it was just how things were supposed to be. Over time, that dynamic hardens. People stop checking in. They stop asking how you're doing because you've never given them a reason to think they should. At work, it was similar. I was the person managers trusted with sensitive transitions. The one brought into meetings where tension needed to be lowered, not escalated. I learned early that calm is disarming, that being underestimated can feel safer than being scrutinized. And at home, I carried that same composure. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't dramatize disappointment. If something felt off between my husband and me, I'd tell myself it was temporary. Stress, work, life phases, all the reasonable explanations that keep you from asking unreasonable questions. From the outside, we looked fine, comfortable, even. We weren't volatile, and we weren't cold. We existed in a steady middle that people mistake for happiness. When friends joked about long marriages becoming dull, my husband would smile and say, "We're just tired, that's all." I repeated that sentence to myself more times than I can count. I didn't see myself as neglected. That word felt too dramatic, too self-indulgent. Instead, I thought of myself as adaptable, flexible, someone who didn't need constant emotional maintenance. I told myself that if I wanted more connection, I could initiate it. And if I didn't, it must not be that important. The truth is, I had slowly become the background hum of our life together. Reliable, predictable, easy to overlook because I never demanded focus. When my husband was distracted, I filled the silence. When he pulled back, I gave him space. When he stopped noticing details about me, I noticed them myself and moved on. There's a particular kind of invisibility that doesn't hurt sharply. It dulls you instead. It convinces you that this is what adulthood looks like. That wanting more presence is childish. That quiet endurance is a virtue. I wasn't unhappy in a way that felt urgent. I was muted. And because nothing was obviously wrong, no one thought to ask whether anything was actually right. If you had asked me then who I was to the people around me, I would have said dependable, calm, understanding. I wouldn't have mentioned being unseen, because I didn't yet have the language for it. I only knew that I was always available and rarely sought, and for a long time I believed that was enough. The first time I felt it, I didn't name it. I almost missed it entirely, which is what makes it linger in my memory now. It wasn't an argument or a betrayal, just a moment that landed slightly wrong, like a step you don't expect on a familiar staircase. We were at a small dinner with friends, nothing formal, people we'd known for years. Someone asked how we were doing, and before I could answer, my husband laughed and said, "We're fine, just tired. You know how it is." He said it easily, confidently, like a conclusion he'd already reached. I smiled. Everyone nodded. The conversation moved on. What stayed with me wasn't what he said, but how final it felt, as if my internal state had already been summarized, filed away, and didn't require my input. I told myself I was being sensitive, that it was a harmless shorthand, that correcting him would have been awkward and unnecessary. So I didn't. Later that night, I asked him, casually, if he ever felt like we talked less than we used to. He didn't look up from his phone when he answered. "That's just life," he said. "Nothing's wrong." "Nothing's wrong" is a powerful sentence. It ends conversations. It reframes curiosity as overthinking. It suggests that the person asking is the problem with asking at all. I remember nodding again, agreeing, telling myself that if something were truly wrong, I'd feel it more clearly, that real issues announce themselves, that this was just a passing discomfort. After that, small things began to register differently, not loudly, just enough to notice if you were paying attention. He'd cancel plans at the last minute and say he was exhausted, then seem energized when a friend called. He'd forget details I'd told him days earlier, then joke that I was better with that stuff anyway. Once, when I mentioned feeling a little lonely, he smiled in a way that was meant to be reassuring and said, "You're not alone. You have me." The sentence sounded right, but it didn't match the feeling underneath it. It was like being handed a label instead of an experience. No one else noticed these moments. Or maybe they did, and dismissed them the same way I did. I was still functioning, still kind, still composed. There were no seams, no visible cracks. From the outside, everything looked intact. That's how the first cut works. It doesn't bleed. It just creates a place in you that you start to protect without realizing it. You stop bringing things up. You edit yourself for efficiency. You decide what's worth mentioning and what isn't, based on how likely it is to be received. I told myself I was choosing peace, that this was maturity. Those relationships ebb and flow, and this was just a quieter phase. But underneath that reasoning was something more subtle. I was learning that my perceptions weren't welcome unless they came with proof or urgency. And so I began to observe instead of speak. I watched how quickly my feelings were reframed into generalizations. How often did my husband speak for both of us without checking? How easily the explanation of being tired smoothed over any discomfort, for him and for everyone else. I didn't confront him. I didn't pull away. I stayed exactly the same on the surface. But internally, something shifted. A thin line formed between what I felt and what I shared. At the time, I thought I was being patient. Looking back, I see it differently. That was the moment I stopped assuming I'd be heard. And once that assumption is gone, you start listening much more closely than you ever did before. After that first moment, nothing changed all at once. That's the part people don't like to hear. There was no escalation that demanded action, no single incident that justified a reckoning. Instead, there was repetition. Small, deniable, almost reasonable repetition. And repetition is how the unacceptable becomes normal. When I'd ask a question about us, he'd answer with certainty instead of curiosity. "You're overthinking." "It's not that deep." "We're fine." Each phrase was mild on its own. Together they formed a pattern. My perceptions required correction. I began to anticipate those responses, and without consciously deciding to, I adjusted. I framed my thoughts more carefully. I softened my tone. I delayed conversations until the right moment, which somehow never arrived. Over time, I learned which parts of myself were easier to keep quiet. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult me. That made it harder to name what was happening. Disrespect, when it's polite, wears the costume of practicality. It convinces you that you're asking for too much by wanting more presence, more attentiveness, more engagement. When I'd mention something important to me, he'd listen halfway, respond vaguely, and move on. If I brought it up again later, he'd say, "You already told me that." The implication was that remembering wasn't necessary. Acknowledging once was sufficient. I told myself this was normal. Long relationships settle into efficiency. People stop narrating every feeling. I repeated that explanation the way he repeated, "We're just tired." It became a shared language that allowed us to avoid specifics. The most subtle part was how quickly I took responsibility for the distance. If he seemed distracted, I assumed I was boring. If he forgot something, I assumed I hadn't emphasized it enough. If he didn't ask questions, I assumed I should be more interesting. No one taught me to do that. I just did. Around others, we played our roles well. He was relaxed, likable. I was composed and supportive. When someone complimented our dynamic, he'd squeeze my hand and say, "She keeps everything running." People laughed. I smiled. Inside, something tightened. Being essential is not the same as being cherished. I still didn't feel angry. That came later. At this stage, I felt reasonable, controlled. I believed that if I stayed steady long enough, we'd find our way back to each other. Those relationships reward patience. That silence, when chosen with good intentions, leads to peace. What I didn't see yet was how silence, when it becomes a habit, starts to edit your identity. You stop sharing things that don't feel welcome. You stop asking questions that might lead nowhere. You learn to manage disappointment privately so it doesn't inconvenience anyone else. And because I was capable, emotionally regulated, functional, outwardly fine, no one worried about me, including me. I normalized the feeling of being slightly dismissed because it came wrapped in politeness. There was always a logical reason. He was busy. He was tired. He didn't mean it that way. And because there was no overt cruelty, I told myself there was no harm. But harm doesn't need a malice to exist. It only needs consistency. By the time I noticed how much I was filtering myself, it already felt familiar. Like a posture you've held too long. You don't feel the strain until you try to stand up straight again. I wasn't being pushed out of my own life. I was stepping back, one reasonable step at a time. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to realize that I wasn't just adapting. I was being cast. Not in a dramatic way. No one sat me down and explained expectations. It happened quietly, through repetition and reward. When I was agreeable, things stayed smooth. When I asked for more, the atmosphere tightened. Over time, I learned which version of myself fit most comfortably into the life we shared. I was the reliable one, the one who didn't need checking in on, the one who would handle it. If a decision had to be made, he'd say, "Whatever you think is best." At first, I appreciated the trust. Later, I understood it was a withdrawal. He wasn't collaborating. He was opting out. Responsibility, without partnership, is a lonely thing. When friends asked about our plans, he'd look to me to answer. When the family needed coordination, my name came up automatically. I became the point of contact, the emotional buffer, the interpreter of moods. I translated his silences into explanations that made sense to other people. And I did it well. That competence became my role. Useful, dependable, invisible. There's a particular danger in being the person who can handle everything. People stop imagining that you might not want to, or that carrying it all has a cost. My husband trusted that I would adapt to whatever shape the relationship took. And because I had, for so long, that trust didn't feel misplaced. I noticed that when I pulled back even slightly, when I didn't remind him of something, didn't smooth over a moment, didn't fill the silence, he looked unsettled, not concerned, just confused, as if a background process had stopped running and he wasn't sure why. Once, after a long day, I told him I felt disconnected. He listened, nodded, and said, "You're strong. You always bounce back." It was meant as reassurance. What it told me was that resilience had replaced attentiveness. My ability to endure had become the justification for not showing up. I began to see the outline of the role more clearly. I was there to stabilize, not to challenge, to support, not to disrupt, to understand, not to be understood. And the most unsettling part? I had helped build that role. Every time I minimized my needs, every time I chose harmony over honesty. Every time I told myself it wasn't worth the effort to explain how something made me feel. There was no villain in this realization, just a dynamic that had settled into place because it was convenient for everyone except me. I didn't feel trapped. I felt miscast. The role required consistency, not presence, reliability, not intimacy. As long as I performed it well, nothing else was expected. And because I was good at it, no one questioned whether I wanted something different. That's when I started paying attention, not to him, but to myself. How often I edited my thoughts before speaking. How rarely I felt genuinely seen. How being low maintenance had slowly turned into being low priority. I wasn't angry yet, I was alert. And once you see the role you've been assigned, you start noticing all the ways it limits who you're allowed to be. The shift didn't happen during a fight or a revelation. It happened on a morning that looked exactly like every other morning. That's how I know it was real. I was standing in this kitchen, waiting for the coffee to finish brewing. My husband was scrolling through his phone, half listening as I mentioned an upcoming work deadline. He nodded without looking up. I stopped mid-sentence. Not to test him, not consciously. I just paused. He didn't notice. The silence stretched long enough to feel intentional, even though it wasn't. And in that space, something inside me settled, not with sadness, not even disappointment, just clarity. I realized I wasn't talking to be heard anymore. I was talking to maintain the rhythm of the relationship, filling space so nothing felt wrong, performing a connection rather than experiencing it. That was the moment I stopped. Not outwardly. I finished my sentence. I smiled. I left for work. Nothing in my behavior changed enough for anyone else to detect it. But internally, a switch flipped. I stopped assuming that effort would be met halfway. I stopped waiting for validation before trusting my own perceptions. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider a thought I'd been avoiding. What if this doesn't get better? Not as a threat, as a possibility. I spent that day unusually quiet, not withdrawn, just observant. I noticed how often I anticipated his needs before he expressed them, how rarely he did the same for me, how the balance had shifted so gradually that neither of us could point to when it happened. And instead of rushing to fix it, I let myself sit with the discomfort. That was new. I didn't confront him that evening. I didn't ask for reassurance. I made dinner, we talked about logistics, and we went to bed. On the surface, everything was unchanged, but my internal posture was different. I was no longer leaning forward, trying to close the gap by myself. I started asking quieter questions, not out loud, but honestly. If nothing changes, am I willing to stay exactly like this? If I'm always the one adjusting, what does that say about my place in this relationship? There was no answer yet, just awareness. That night, lying awake beside him, I noticed how calm I felt. Not numb, not resigned. Calm in the way you feel when you stop arguing with reality. When you stop telling yourself stories that require constant maintenance. I wasn't planning an exit. I wasn't rehearsing speeches. I wasn't angry enough for that. I was simply presented with the truth as it was, without softening it. And that presence changed everything, because once you stop trying to correct someone else's behavior, you free up an enormous amount of energy. Energy that can be used to observe, to understand, to decide. That was the day something shifted. Not in him, in me. After that morning, my silence changed quality. Before, it had been a reflex, a way to avoid friction, to keep things smooth. Now it was deliberate. I wasn't withholding or punishing. I was simply no longer compensating for what wasn't there. I stopped narrating my inner world by default. If he asked how my day was, I answered honestly, but briefly. I didn't pad my responses with emotional invitations he wasn't likely to accept. If he didn't ask follow-up questions, I didn't fill the gap. This wasn't withdrawal, it was recalibration. What surprised me was how quickly my change was misread. He seemed to assume I was tired, or stressed, or in my head. All familiar explanations that required no adjustment from him. He didn't ask what had shifted, because from his perspective, nothing had. That's the thing about being the stable one. When you stop stabilizing, people assume it's temporary. I began to listen more than I spoke. Not in a suspicious way, just attentively. I noticed patterns I'd previously smoothed over. How often he framed decisions as fates accompli. How easily he accepted my support without offering his own. How my emotional availability had become a given, not a gift. And because I wasn't reacting, those patterns became clearer. Silence creates space. In that space, behavior reveals itself. I also noticed something else. How much energy I had been spending managing his comfort. Without that effort, I felt lighter, more grounded, less reactive. I wasn't bracing myself for dismissal because I wasn't offering anything that required acknowledgement. From the outside, I probably looked the same. Calm, functional, maybe a little quieter. Inside, I was more awake than I'd been in years. He didn't push. He didn't probe. He enjoyed the ease of not having to engage deeply. That told me more than any argument could have. When emotional labor disappears, people either notice the absence or they relax into it. He relaxed. That was information. I didn't interpret it as cruelty, just a preference. He preferred a version of our relationship that required less from him. And because I had always provided that, he assumed it would continue. Silence in this phase wasn't about hiding my feelings. It was about letting reality speak without interruption. About seeing what happened when I stopped guiding the narrative. I started documenting, not obsessively, not with an agenda, just noting things the way you do when you're trying to understand a system. Dates, changes in behavior, moments that felt incongruent. I didn't know yet what I was preparing for. I only knew I didn't want to rely on memory alone. Emotion fades, patterns don't. This wasn't a strategy in the dramatic sense. It was respect for my own clarity. I was giving myself time to see the full shape of things before deciding what they meant. Silence had stopped being something that happened to me. It had become something I chose. While everything on the surface remained calm, something methodical was taking shape underneath. Not out of suspicion at first, out of self-respect. When you stop explaining yourself, you start seeing how much explanation was doing the work. Without my emotional narration, small inconsistencies stood on their own. I didn't interrogate them. I just noted them. I noticed how his schedule became less specific, meetings that ran late without details, errands that took longer than they used to, a phone that stayed face down more often, not dramatically, just enough to register if you weren't trying to see it. I didn't ask questions. Questions invite answers, and answers invite stories. I wasn't ready for stories yet. Instead, I began to prepare in quiet, ordinary ways that would have looked like nothing to anyone else. I updated passwords, reviewed shared accounts, reacquainted myself with our financial layout, not because I suspected betrayal, but because I realized how little I'd needed to look before. Trust had made me passive. Awareness made me competent again. I started writing more consistently in my notebook. Not emotions, facts, dates, changes, words used repeatedly, absences that followed certain patterns. I didn't interpret them. I didn't dramatize them. I just let them exist on the page. There's a strange calm that comes with documentation. It grounds you. It replaces spiraling with structure. Instead of asking, "Am I imagining this?" you start asking, "What does this actually show?" At work, I was used to preparing quietly before major transitions, risk assessments, contingency planning. You don't announce those things. You do them so that if something shifts, you're not scrambling. That same instinct activated here. What he never noticed, was that my silence wasn't emptiness. It was attention. I was no longer reacting in real time. I was watching from a steadier distance. He continued as before, casual, comfortable, confident that nothing fundamental had changed. And he was right, in one sense. I hadn't confronted him. I hadn't altered routines. I hadn't demanded reassurance. But internally, I had stopped assuming good faith as a default. I was open, but not naive. Curious, but not invested in being convinced. I also noticed how easily he accepted my quiet, how little he wondered about it. That absence of curiosity told me more than any confession could have. When someone senses a shift and doesn't lean in, it's often because leaning in would require accountability. Preparation isn't dramatic. It's dull, repetitive. It looks like competence is returning to its owner. I didn't know yet what I would find, or if I would find anything at all. But I knew this. Whatever the truth was, I wanted to meet it from a place of steadiness, not shock. And so I kept watching, calmly, carefully. Because when you stop needing reassurance, you become very difficult to mislead. I didn't go looking for proof. That's important to say. The reveal came to me the way truth often does, through routine, not suspicion. On a quiet afternoon, I picked up the shared tablet we'd both used for years. It lived in the drawer by the couch, charged, unguarded. We used it for recipes, travel plans, the occasional movie on nights when we were too tired to decide anything else. That day, I was trying to pull up a document I'd opened earlier in the week. When the screen lit up, it wasn't where I'd left it. A messaging app was open, not locked, not hidden, just there. I didn't feel a jolt. No cinematic rush of blood, no ringing in my ears. What I felt was stillness, the kind that settles in your chest when something aligns too perfectly to argue with. The messages weren't explicit in the way people expect betrayal to look. No dramatic declarations, no careless photographs, just familiarity, ease, and intimacy that had rhythm to it, the kind that doesn't form overnight. She was 12 years younger. The age difference wasn't what struck me first, though it registered. What struck me was how attentive he sounded, how curious, how present. He asked questions, remembered details, followed up. The version of him on that screen was not the one I'd been living with. I sat down. I didn't scroll frantically. I didn't dig for pain. I read slowly, deliberately, the way you do when accuracy matters. Dates confirmed patterns I'd already noticed. Late meetings, energized evenings. The vague explanations that had once seemed reasonable now had context. There was no urge to confront him immediately, no desire to cry or call a friend. What I felt was clarity, clean, sharp, almost relieving, the kind that replaces doubt with understanding. So this was it, not exhaustion, not a phase, not miscommunication. The sentence, "We're just tired," rearranged itself in my mind, not as a misunderstanding, but as a cover. Not necessarily a malicious one, just a convenient one. A phrase that required no follow-up, no accountability. I closed the app, put the tablet back where I found it, made myself a cup of tea. The world didn't tilt. The house didn't feel unfamiliar. I didn't feel foolish. I felt intact. That surprised me most. I realized I had already done the grieving, quietly, over months. I had mourned the version of the relationship I thought we had while I was still inside it. By the time the truth appeared, I wasn't losing an illusion. I was confirming a reality. I didn't feel superior. I didn't feel vengeful. I felt done with guessing. What I found on that tablet wasn't just evidence of an affair. It was evidence of choice. Choice to invest energy elsewhere. Choice to let me carry the emotional steadiness while he redirected his attention. Choice to enjoy my reliability while offering someone else his presence. That distinction mattered. I didn't screenshot anything. I didn't send myself copies in a panic. I noted what I needed to note. Names, dates, patterns, enough to be certain, enough to never doubt myself later. Then I returned to my day. We spoke that evening about logistics, dinner plans, a bill that needed paying. He kissed my cheek the way he always did. Familiar. Absent. I didn't pull away. I didn't lean in. Inside, I felt remarkably calm, because discovery doesn't always break you. Sometimes it organizes you. I went to bed knowing something irreversible had happened, not in our marriage, but in me. The ambiguity was gone. The questions were answered. The fog had lifted without drama, and in its place was a simple, steady resolve. Whatever came next, I would not move from confusion. I would move from truth. Knowing something and acting on it are two different kinds of courage. After the discovery, I didn't rush toward a conclusion. I let the knowledge settle, the way you let sediment fall to the bottom of a glass before you drink from it. I wanted to see clearly, without the distortion of adrenaline or grief. I considered my options carefully. Confrontation was the most obvious. I could ask questions, demand explanations, force a reckoning. I imagined the likely outcomes: denial softened by half-truths, apologies framed as confusion, promises shaped more by fear than insight. Even in the best version, I would become the emotional center again, managing reactions, guiding the conversation, absorbing the fallout. I had already done that work for too long. I also considered silence as avoidance, pretending I didn't know, maintaining the status quo. That option felt hollow, not because I needed drama, but because it required me to abandon myself again. Knowledge changes responsibility. Once you see, you're accountable for what you do with it. The third option was the quiet one, the irreversible one. It didn't involve exposing him or humiliating anyone. It involved preparing my life for a future in which I did not have to negotiate my worth, a future built on alignment, not endurance. I thought about timing, about finances, about logistics, about dignity. I asked myself not what would hurt him most, but what would leave me most intact. That question narrowed things quickly. I decided I would not confront him until I was ready to leave without chaos. Not as a threat, as a boundary. I didn't owe him my rawest emotions before I had secured my footing. Transparency doesn't require self-sacrifice. This decision wasn't fueled by anger. It was fueled by self-trust. I believed my own perceptions enough now to act without external validation. I set a private marker in my mind. Not a deadline, just a point of no return. From here on, every action would move me toward independence. Calmly, legally, ethically. I didn't change my behavior toward him in ways he could point to. I stayed polite, functional, predictable. That consistency wasn't deception, it was clarity. I knew where I was going, even if he didn't. There's a myth that power announces itself with bold gestures. In reality, power often looks like restraint, like patience that's no longer hopeful, but deliberate. The decision I made that week reshaped everything that followed. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was final. I had crossed from questioning into choosing, and once you choose yourself quietly, the noise around you starts to lose its influence. The strange thing about moving in silence is how ordinary it feels while you're doing it. There's no soundtrack, no sense of urgency that other people can detect. Your days still look the same from the outside. You go to work, you answer messages, you make dinner, you smile at the right moments, and yet, underneath that normalcy, everything is being rearranged. Once I made my decision, I became very precise. Not cold, precise. Emotion had already delivered its information. From this point on, clarity was the priority. The first thing I did was reclaim visibility over my own life. Quietly, methodically. I reviewed every shared account, every recurring payment, every automatic decision I had once handled on autopilot. Not with suspicion, but with professionalism. This was no different from stepping into a leadership role at work during a transition. You don't panic, you inventory. I opened a new checking account in my own name. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't drain anything or move money impulsively. I simply created separation where there had been an assumption. Independence begins with options, not ultimatums. I updated my personal documents, passport expiration dates, employment records, emergency contacts. Small things people delay when they feel secure. Things that become urgent only when security turns out to be conditional. At night, lying beside him, I noticed how calm my body felt. No racing thoughts, no rehearsed conversations. The anxiety I'd lived with for months, subtle but constant, had evaporated. Not because the situation was resolved, but because uncertainty was. There's relief in knowing where you stand, even if where you stand is alone. I consulted a lawyer quietly, framed not as a crisis, but as an informational conversation. I didn't present evidence. I asked questions. What does separation look like when assets are shared? What timelines protect dignity rather than escalate conflict? What preparation prevents chaos later? I took notes, asked follow-ups, thanked her for her time. No one noticed. At home, I continued performing my role with competence, but without emotional overextension. If he spoke, I listened. If he was distracted, I didn't compensate. I stopped managing the emotional temperature of the room. That space, once filled by my attentiveness, remained empty. He didn't comment on it. That told me everything I needed to know. I began to imagine my future in practical terms, not abstract ones. What kind of space did I want to live in? What did my days look like without carrying someone else's inertia? I didn't fantasize about happiness. I planned for stability. Happiness can grow later. Stability is the soil. I also paid attention to timing. There's a difference between acting quickly and acting cleanly. I wasn't interested in shock value. I wanted coherence. I wanted my departure when it came to feel inevitable rather than explosive. This phase required restraint. There were moments, quiet ones, when I felt the urge to ask why, to hear him explain himself, to see whether remorse would surface if I gave him the opportunity. But I recognized that urge for what it was, a desire for validation from someone who had already opted out of offering it, so I didn't ask. Instead, I watched how easily he moved through his days, unburdened by introspection, how comfortable he was with my continued reliability, how little curiosity he showed about my internal world. Moving in silence doesn't mean moving in secret. It means moving without asking permission. I told one person, carefully, not to vent, not to gather opinions, just to ensure I wasn't isolated. I chose someone who wouldn't dramatize, wouldn't rush me, wouldn't turn my process into a project. They didn't ask why I hadn't confronted him yet. They understood that timing is a form of self-respect. Weeks passed. Not wasted weeks. Productive ones. I felt myself stepping into a quieter authority over my own life. Decisions that once felt heavy now felt obvious. I trusted my judgment without running it through someone else's comfort first. At times, I caught glimpses of his complacency, the ease with which he assumed continuity. That ease was not cruelty. It was entitlement born from habit. He had grown accustomed to my presence as infrastructure, always there, never questioned. Infrastructure is only noticed when it's gone. I didn't change my appearance. I didn't signal withdrawal. I didn't punish him with distance. That wasn't the point. The point was alignment, my actions matching my awareness. The irony is that this was the most honest I'd been in years. I wasn't pretending to be confused. I wasn't hoping for change. I wasn't negotiating with reality. I was preparing. And preparation, when done well, feels almost invisible. By the time I sensed the next phase approaching, I wasn't nervous. I was steady. The kind of steadiness that comes from knowing you can stand on your own, even if the ground shifts. Because silence isn't passive when it's chosen, it's composure in motion. Consequences rarely arrive all at once. They don't announce themselves with explanations or apologies. Most of the time, they arrive as absences, small disruptions in the comfort people didn't realize depended on you. The first thing he noticed wasn't emotional. It was practical. I stopped reminding him about things. Not pointedly, not as a test. I simply let responsibility return to its owner. Deadlines, appointments, small social obligations he had always assumed I'd track. When he forgot something and looked at me with mild surprise, I didn't rush to repair it. "Oh," I'd say evenly, "I didn't realize you wanted me to handle that." There was no accusation in my voice, just clarity. At first, he laughed it off, made a joke about being scattered. He didn't connect the dots because, from his perspective, nothing big had changed. The marriage was still intact. The routine still mostly held. I was still there. But systems don't fail dramatically at first. They fail quietly when the invisible supports are removed. He began to feel slightly off balance. Conversations stalled where I used to carry them. Decisions lingered longer. Social plans required more effort. The ease he'd grown used to started costing him attention. I noticed the shift in his posture before he noticed it in himself. He asked more questions, not about me, but about logistics. Did we already pay this? Do you know when my parents are coming? Each time I answered truthfully, but briefly. Sometimes the answer was no. I wasn't withholding, I just wasn't preempting. What he was feeling, though he didn't have language for it, was the loss of frictionless living. The quiet privilege of being partnered with someone who manages more than their share without complaint. And because he couldn't name the loss, it expressed itself as restlessness. He became more distracted at home, not less. More time on his phone, longer silences, not because he sensed betrayal, but because the emotional economy of our relationship had changed. The labor he'd outsourced to me hadn't disappeared. It had simply returned to him. I watched this without satisfaction, without anger, mostly with curiosity. This was the part people imagine as triumph. It wasn't. It was instructional. I saw how quickly he felt unsettled when my reliability stopped compensating for his disengagement. How little tolerance he had for ambiguity when he was the one carrying it. How foreign it felt to him to navigate emotional quiet without guidance. There were moments, brief ones, when he seemed close to asking me what was wrong. But each time he stopped short. Perhaps because asking would require listening, and listening would require the possibility of hearing something irreversible. So instead he hovered at the edge of concern, restless, mildly irritated, uncertain where the imbalance was coming from. Around us, others began to feel it too. Friends noticed I was less available, not withdrawn, just selective. I declined invitations I would once have accepted out of obligation. When asked why, I said I was focusing on myself. It was true, and it confused people who had grown used to my emotional availability. Some responded with warmth, others with distance. Both reactions were informative. The most striking consequence, though, was internal. As the weeks passed, I felt stronger, not in a dramatic, empowered way, but in a grounded one. My sense of self stopped orbiting the relationship. I slept better, thought more clearly. I wasn't bracing for dismissal because I wasn't seeking validation. I also noticed how little he adjusted in response to my shift. He didn't step forward emotionally. He didn't offer a repair. He didn't ask deeper questions. That told me something important. The relationship had functioned because I had been doing the adapting. Without that, there was no automatic correction. The imbalance had always been there. It was just no longer masked. One evening, he mentioned, almost casually, that things felt different lately. He didn't say worse. He didn't say better. Just different. I nodded. Different how? He shrugged. I don't know. Quieter. The word hung between us. I didn't explain. I didn't reassure him. I let the quiet exist. Because this was the consequence phase, the part where reality begins to assert itself without commentary, where people sense loss before they understand its source, where comfort erodes before accountability appears. Nothing had exploded, nothing had been exposed, but the ground had shifted, and he was starting to feel it under his feet. By the time panic arrived, the window for repair had already closed. That's the part people misunderstand. They think relationships end when someone gives up. In reality, they end when one person finally sees clearly, and the other notices too late. His unease sharpened gradually. What had started as mild restlessness became a low-grade anxiety he couldn't place. He began hovering more when I was in the room, asking questions that didn't quite reach curiosity, making comments that sounded like invitations but weren't brave enough to be honest. "You've been quiet lately," he said one evening, as if it were an observation about the weather. I looked up from what I was doing. "Have I? Yeah, I mean, you're here, but you seem somewhere else." There it was. Not concern for why I might feel that way, just discomfort with the shift itself. I nodded slowly. "I've been thinking." "About what?" he asked quickly, too quickly. I paused. Not for effect, for accuracy, about things that matter. That answer unsettled him. I could see it in the way his shoulders tightened, the way he leaned back slightly, as if bracing. He laughed lightly, trying to dilute the moment. "Well, don't think too hard," he said. We're okay. The sentence landed differently now, not as reassurance but as denial. Over the next few weeks, his behavior changed in small, telling ways. He became more attentive, suddenly interested in my day, my schedule, my mood. He suggested dinners, weekend plans, and shared activities we hadn't done in months. On the surface, it looked like an effort, but effort without insight feels hollow, like maintenance performed on a structure whose foundation is already compromised. I watched him try to reinsert himself into a space I'd already reclaimed. Not maliciously, not manipulatively, just belatedly. He was responding to discomfort, not understanding. He didn't say I've been distant. He didn't say I'm sorry. He didn't say I want to know you again. Instead, he said things like, we should do more together, and I feel like we've been out of sync, and maybe we just need a vacation. Solutions offered without diagnosis. The irony was almost unbearable. For so long I had brought questions and been given conclusions. Now he brought conclusions and avoided questions. There were moments, brief, fragile ones, where I sensed he was close to the truth, where he looked at me as if trying to reconcile the woman in front of him with the certainty that something fundamental had shifted. In those moments, his voice softened. Are you happy? He asked once late at night. I considered the question carefully. I'm clear, I said. That wasn't the answer he wanted. Clarity doesn't invite negotiation. Panic doesn't always look like desperation. Sometimes it looks like overcompensation. He cleaned more, talked more, tried to recreate a version of us that existed before I stopped compensating for his absence. But that version required my participation, and I was no longer available for roles that asked me to disappear. What he didn't understand, what he couldn't understand, was that repair requires presence before withdrawal becomes choice. By the time he noticed the distance, it wasn't distance anymore. It was a direction. I'd already grieved him, already let go of the expectation that he would meet me where I was. His sudden attention felt like someone arriving at a closed door and knocking politely, unaware that the house had already been emptied. And still, I didn't confront him, not yet, because confrontation wasn't the point. Resolution was. I wasn't waiting for him to fail or succeed at saving us. I wasn't testing his remorse. I was watching whether he could tolerate reality without rewriting it. He couldn't. Every attempt he made to fix things avoided the core issue, that he had chosen disengagement long before I chose departure. That his panic was about loss of comfort, not loss of intimacy. There is a moment in these situations when you realize that even if the other person did everything right from here on out, it wouldn't change what's already been learned. Trust isn't only about fidelity. It's about attentiveness, about showing up before silence hardens into clarity. By the time he reached for me, I had already stepped away. Not physically, not publicly, but internally. And once that happens, no amount of retroactive effort can reopen what's closed. It wasn't cruel, it was simply final, and he could feel it. That was the hardest part. Not the betrayal, not the unraveling, but watching someone realize that the chance to repair something meaningful had passed quietly, without an argument, without a scene, without a single raised voice. Too late. The confrontation didn't happen on the day I planned it. It happened on the day it no longer required preparation. We were sitting across from each other at the kitchen table. No tension in the room that an outsider could name, just a quiet that had become familiar. He was talking about something inconsequential. Work, I think. And I realized, with a surprising sense of calm, that I didn't need to carry this any longer. Not because I was overwhelmed, because I was finished. Can we talk? I said. He looked relieved. That detail stayed with me, as if he'd been waiting for permission to acknowledge what he felt but couldn't articulate. Of course, he said quickly. I didn't accuse. I didn't build a case. I didn't recount every moment that had led us here. I didn't need to. Those explanations would have been for him, not for me. I know, I said simply. He froze. Not dramatically, but completely. The way people do when their internal timeline collapses. Know what? He asked, though his voice had already changed. I know about her, I said. I saw the messages on the tablet. Silence followed. Real silence. Not the managed kind we'd lived with for years. His face shifted through a series of emotions too quick to control. Surprise, calculation, regret, fear. He opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. It's not, he started, then stopped. I didn't mean for it to. I raised my hand gently, not to silence him, but to slow the moment down. I'm not here to debate details, I said. I'm here to tell you what's happening. That confused him. People expect confrontation to be reactive. They expect anger or bargaining or tears. What unsettles them is composure. He tried to explain anyway, not in a manipulative way, more like someone reaching for language they'd avoided developing. He talked about feeling disconnected, about things just happening, about how he never intended to hurt me. I listened, not because I needed closure, but because I wanted to remain accurate. His words confirmed what I already understood, that disengagement had been his solution to discomfort long before the affair began. When he finished, he looked at me expectantly, waiting for my response, my reaction, my forgiveness, maybe. "I believe you," I said, "about what you intended." He exhaled, relieved. "But intention isn't the issue," I continued. "Attention is." That landed differently. He frowned slightly, as if trying to follow. "You stopped showing up," I said calmly, "long before you started talking to her. You chose absence, repeatedly, and I adapted, until I didn't." He opened his mouth to interrupt. I didn't stop him this time. "I'm not asking for an apology," I said, "and I'm not offering one. I'm telling you that I'm leaving." The words didn't shake. They didn't echo. They just existed. He stared at me, disbelief replacing regret. "Leaving?" he repeated. "We can fix this. I'm willing to—" "I know," I said. "That's why this is hard for you. You're willing now." He looked wounded, genuinely. "Isn't that what matters?" I shook my head. "It matters when it comes before clarity, not after." He asked if I'd already decided. I told him yes. He asked how long I'd known. I told him long enough. He asked why I hadn't said anything sooner. "Because I needed to be sure," I said, "and because I didn't want to argue my way into leaving. I wanted to walk out without confusion." There was no yelling, no accusations thrown back and forth, just a slow dawning on his face that this conversation wasn't a negotiation, that there was no emotional leverage left to pull. I told him I'd already spoken to a lawyer, that I'd be moving out, that the details would be handled cleanly. He sat back in his chair, stunned. "You're so calm," he said, almost accusingly. "I know," I replied. "I didn't rush here." That was the moment it clicked for him. Not what I knew, but how long I'd known, how far ahead of him I already was. And in that realization, something shifted from protest to loss. I stood up. "I hope you understand this someday," I said, "but I don't need you to." I didn't storm out. I didn't collapse. I cleared my cup, picked up my keys, and left the house quietly. The confrontation didn't burn. It concluded. After I left, people expected a transformation they could recognize. A new look, a new tone. Some visible marker that I had crossed into a different life. When that didn't happen, they seemed confused. I didn't need to become louder to be different. I didn't need to reinvent myself to prove anything. The change had already happened long before I packed my things. Who I am now is not a reaction to what happened. It's a return. In the weeks after the separation, my life grew quieter in a way that felt spacious, not empty. My days no longer revolved around managing someone else's emotional weather. I noticed how much mental room that created. Decisions felt simpler. Not easier, simpler. I moved into a place that reflected me rather than accommodating someone else's indifference. I chose furniture deliberately. Light over utility, stillness over noise. Every object had an intention. Nothing existed to be tolerated. That mattered more than I expected. I also noticed what I didn't feel. I didn't feel bitterness. I didn't feel the urge to explain myself repeatedly. I didn't feel the need to monitor his life or compare timelines. Those impulses never arrived because I hadn't left in anger. I'd left in alignment. People asked how I was really doing with that tone that assumes survival requires struggle. I told them the truth. I felt clear. That answer unsettled some of them. Others nodded like they recognized something they'd been missing. I learned that clarity can look cold to people who are used to chaos, that boundaries can feel abrupt to those who benefited from your flexibility. That piece doesn't perform well for an audience, and I was fine with that. My sense of self shifted subtly but permanently. I no longer introduced myself through roles I played for others. I didn't describe myself as adaptable or low maintenance. I didn't preemptively minimize my needs. When something matters to me now, I say it. When it doesn't, I let it go without justification. I don't wait for someone to notice my silence before I decide whether to speak. There are moments when memory surfaces, when I think of the woman I was during those years. I don't judge her. She did what she knew how to do. She kept things stable because she believed stability was love. Now I know better. Love isn't maintained through endurance. It's sustained through presence, through curiosity, through the willingness to show up before distance becomes default. Who I am now is someone who listens closely to others, yes, but first to myself. Someone who understands that quiet does not equal invisible and calm does not equal compliant. I don't regret how things ended. I regret only how long I mistook silence for peace. That mistake won't happen again. There's a temptation when a story like this ends to look for villains and victories, to decide who won, who lost, and who deserved what. I've learned that those questions are rarely useful. What matters more is what becomes visible when the noise stops. This wasn't a story about an affair, not really. The messages on the shared tablet didn't start the ending, they confirmed it. The real unraveling happened much earlier, in all the moments where presence was replaced by convenience and curiosity by assumption. If there's a moral here, it isn't about leaving at the first sign of discomfort or staying at all costs. It's about paying attention to the small dismissals we're taught to normalize, about noticing when we're just tired becomes a way to avoid seeing each other at all. People don't always betray you by being cruel. Sometimes they betray you by being comfortable with your absence while you're still in the room. And we don't always lose ourselves in dramatic ways. Sometimes we disappear gradually by choosing harmony over honesty over and over again until silence feels safer than truth. What saved me wasn't confrontation. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even courage in the way stories usually frame it. What saved me was clarity, the decision to trust what I was already sensing without waiting for permission or proof that would satisfy everyone else. I didn't leave because he chose someone younger. I left because I was no longer chosen in the ways that matter. And once I saw that clearly, staying would have meant betraying myself. There's a quiet power in that kind of honesty. Not the kind that demands applause, but the kind that lets you sleep at night without replaying conversations in your head. The kind that doesn't need to be explained because it feels true in your body. If you're listening to this and something feels familiar, if you've ever been the reliable one, the understanding one, the person who carries more than their share, know this. Being calm doesn't mean you're unaffected. Being patient doesn't mean you're invisible. And being quiet doesn't mean you're powerless. Sometimes the strongest move you'll ever make is deciding not to argue your way into being valued. I'll leave you with this question, and I genuinely like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever reached a point where you realized you weren't angry anymore? You were just clear? Thank you for listening.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.